get started. For anybody new that's joining us, thank you for being part of our multi-part series today. It is my pleasure to introduce Mike Louden. Yes, this is our third session. I said it wrong. The other two sessions I kept saying Louden, even though I know it's Louden. So this is a big moment for me. So really excited to have Mark here. I'll have him introduce himself. I'm just going to ask that if people do have questions, if we can just hold those off until we get to the Q&A portion. Content is about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll get some questions at the end. For those of you online, use the chat feature and we'll get to your questions as well.
All right, thanks, Melissa. So thanks everybody for, there's a lot of folks I've got that have been here since the beginning at 11:30. So thank you for sticking around. For those who are new, welcome. And for folks who are out there in Zoom land that are new, welcome to you too. So this is the third presentation I'm doing today. As Melissa indicated, I did a general one, did one on sort of healthcare, and then this one's on human services. And then we'll be doing a reprise of the general one at 5:30 again. So I'm going to start off by, the title is Serving Plain Communities, and I need to define what is meant by plain. And so I'm going to advance the slide here. And start off with this graphic that I've used in the other presentations as well. So plain people are members of Anabaptist Christian groups. So the Christian family of churches is very, very big. And there's one branch that's known as the Anabaptists. And the Anabaptists are maybe less well known. A distinctive about Anabaptist churches is that I'm, for example, a Mennonite myself. Our churches practice what's called believer's baptism or adult baptism, which means that infants are not baptized. The idea being that to join a church should be a conscious decision on the part of the person who's actually joining the church, rather than a decision that, say, parents make for a child or communities member make for somebody else. The ultimate end product or whatever for of Anabaptists, as far as religious education goes, is very similar to other churches, except that you have baptism, what we call like confirmation or religious education, first communion, all happening at the same time rather than sort of incrementally, which is how most other churches do it. The Anabaptist movement began as part of the Protestant Reformation almost exactly 500 years ago. It started actually in Switzerland, but it spread throughout Central Europe and up into the Netherlands and Northern Germany. And there are four major subgroups of Anabaptists today that are represented in this chart here: so-called Hutterites, Brethren, Mennonites, and Amish. And three of these four groups are represented here in Wisconsin. Wisconsin, despite its relatively small size, has a very large, relatively speaking, and diverse Anabaptist population. And this is only a very, very general overview. The Amish are the largest of the so-called plain Anabaptists. We'll be talking a little bit more about what plain means in a moment. But for the time being, plain essentially means members of Anabaptist churches who dress and groom themselves distinctively and limit the use of technology and sort of mark their religious identity very clearly in an outward fashion. So on this chart here, things that are marked in either blue or relatively dark green to a sort of lighter green here. For example here, most people that identify as Amish would be considered plain. Among Mennonites, it's more of a mixed picture here. In Wisconsin, the plain diversity is actually quite large, and the Amish represent the major group. The second largest group would be the so-called Old Order Mennonites, who subdivide into two groups depending on whether they own or operate automobiles or not. So the horse and buggy driving older Mennonites are also known as the Grofdale Conference Mennonites. They're the folks that are living down by Thorpe and Withy. And then those who are very, very closely related to them in terms of family ties as well as spiritually are known as Weaverland Conference, Old Order Mennonites. They're also known as Black Bumper Mennonites because they, when automobiles came out, they preferred to use automobiles that were completely black, or the chrome at that time when it was available painted. Then a smaller group of plain people in Wisconsin are known as the Old German Baptist Brethren. There are other Brethren churches as well, but the term German Baptist is a little bit more descriptive than Brethren. Refers to the fact that when they practice adult baptism, like the other Anabaptist churches, they do it by full immersion rather than just sprinkling, which is how Amish and Mennonites do it. The Hutterites are a group that are an Anabaptist group that are represented not in Wisconsin. They live mostly in Canada, in Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. and in the Dakotas and Montana and a little part of Washington. They are a collectivist society, which means they actually live in distinct colonies, whereas the other plain Anabaptist groups live in relatively close proximity to one another, but don't live in distinct sort of geographically marked off communities. And the term plain and non-plain is kind of important if we're talking about plain people. Plain people in general, as I say, mark their identity as Anabaptist Christians outwardly by dressing distinctively, grooming themselves distinctively, and limiting technology. In general, they tend to be more conservative or traditional, is the way that's described. Most Anabaptists worldwide, and this is a global church movement now, are actually non-plain. So, for example, the church that I belong to is a non-plain Mennonite church, so we don't dress distinctively, don't have any limitations on technology whatsoever. By far the largest group of plain Anabaptists, not only in Wisconsin, but in the United States and Canada, where most plain people are Amish. Old German Mennonites would be, like older Mennonites would be at this intersection here, and then Old German Baptist Brethren. There's actually another group that I haven't talked about in the other sections that's also part of the tapestry of Anabaptist churches in Wisconsin, and they call themselves Amish Mennonites. And down near the Wisconsin River, especially near the community of Muscadet, there are a couple of Amish Mennonite congregations. They're actually descended mostly from Amish, but adopted some practices that are more consistent with Mennonites. So it's a very, very rich kind of diversity in Wisconsin. Summarizing here, the plain people are members of traditional or conservative Anabaptist Christian groups, mark their identity outwardly in a very obvious way through just dressing and grooming themselves distinctively and limiting technology. Now, the Amish population, as I say, is the largest of the plain people. It's very small relative to the overall North American population, but it's growing rapidly because of very, very large family sizes and very low attrition rates, so high retention rates. It's currently about 367,000 folks spread out across 32 US states. Wisconsin has the fourth largest plain and then also Amish population. So Pennsylvania and Ohio are always 1 and 2, Indiana's third. There are about 5,000 older Mennonites in the state, and then smaller numbers, probably in the hundreds, maybe a couple of thousand of Old German Baptist Brethren. Most plain people are concentrated in where we are in this part of the state, and then going farther south, so broadly speaking, western Wisconsin. Less so when you get down towards Milwaukee in that corridor, simply because there's less available land. Land prices are more expensive. You're sort of in that kind of Milwaukee, Chicago corridor, and it's not something that's really, it's much more developed than other parts of the state. The relative sizes of the settlements that I've indicated here are marked by the relative sizes of the quilts. Vernon County has the largest plain population, and specifically the community near the town of Cashton. So it's Cashton Amish community, fairly conservative. And the second largest one is the Kingston-Dalton community, which is just north of where I am in Dane County, that straddles Columbia, Marquette, and Green Lake counties. But up here, where we are right now in Taylor County, not far from Marathon and Clark counties, you'll see that there's a very, very large, mostly Amish presence. The older Mennonites are basically concentrated mostly in Clark County, and then down in the southwest part of the state near Grant County. That's where older Mennonites are. Old German Baptists are very, very much smaller population, basically over toward Vernon and Monroe counties here, but smaller pockets elsewhere in the state. Now, talking specifically about human services, a lot of human service providers, and in fact, really service providers like, say, healthcare workers and others who serve the Amish, often bring to the Amish and other plain groups some fairly strongly held opinions, or at least some images that have been crafted by popular media. So the Amish are a very familiar group. Less is known about Mennonites. Almost nothing is known about German Baptists and smaller groups, but it makes sense because the Amish are the largest plain group. And a lot of what people kind of popularly know or believe about Amish, and then by extension plain people, is really not necessarily accurate. It's sort of like a germ of truth, but then there are a lot of stereotypes, or there are stories that they've heard that may or may not be true. And if they are true, they're not necessarily representative of plain people generally. So things that make their way into the popular media are not necessarily balanced pictures. They're things that attract audiences. And then for the the people that produce the websites or the cable TV shows, the reality TV shows generate revenue. And especially a lot of young people, many of my students are familiar with some of these reality TV shows that sort of center on Amish youth going wild. And the most notorious one was Amish Mafia, which is no longer being produced. But this was a program that was particularly kind of out of sync with actual reality, because the premise of it was that there is this sort of posse or vigilante group of young Amish people who are tooling around the back roads of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, with firearms, protecting their community. And Amish, Mennonites, Brethren, and Hutterite churches, all of our churches are so-called peace churches. We're non-resistant churches. So you may not use firearms in any kind of offensive or even defensive capacity, right? And so that's why our people do not serve in the military in a defense capacity. But there's this fascination not with sort of middle-aged or older people, but there's this fascination with younger people, especially somewhat attractive younger people. Think about Jersey Shore, right, which is one of the more notorious reality TV shows that supposedly represented young Italian-American youth from New Jersey. And this is something that a lot of Italian Americans took offense to, because they say this is a very distorted picture and it's not a very complimentary picture. The actors in these so-called Amish reality TV shows are actually not Amish at all. Some of them grew up in Amish families, but they never joined the church, right? So they have some familiarity with Amish culture, Amish life, but in fact are completely unrepresented because they're not actually members of the church. They're part of a small percentage of kids that are born to Amish parents that make the decision not to join the church. And so it's fairly atypical. Most of the stories that people hear about Amish are ex-Amish narratives. And when we talk about abuse, for example, there are many stories that have made their way into the media. One particularly a story that got a lot of press was a series of stories that was produced by Cosmopolitan magazine that profiled 52 survivors of sexual abuse in Plain communities. And from that, I'll be showing you the headline from that in a moment. From that, there's this impression that somehow sexual abuse is widespread in Plain communities. Those stories are true stories, but they're not representative stories. And so they can sort of like shape the opinions of people on the outside that, for example, abuse is widespread, or it's somehow condoned, or it's somehow part of the fabric of the culture, which can, when it comes from service providers, can be somewhat problematic in addressing problems that may in fact exist. But as I say, most of the stories that you read about, Amish people in the media are the sort of man bite dog stories, the ones that are sort of unusual, things that attract attention, rather than like, Amos sowed his oats today or something like that, or, the corn crop was good this year, or that, this family went to Costco and bought 3 jugs of maple syrup rather than 2. I mean, the sort of everyday life is not something that's newsworthy, right? What's newsworthy are typically things that are somewhat racy, maybe a little bit titillating, and things that may be border on the criminal behavior. Life on the wild side attracts Amish teens. Temptations of modern society add to risks. A brown-haired 15-year-old girl paces, gossips, and giggles on a cell phone. She switches deftly from English to a German dialect as she asks about friends, guys, and Saturday night parties. After the call, Sarah Lambright jumps into her horse-drawn buggy and rides home. Now, if you were to take away the fact that she's Amish, this would be completely unnewsworthy, right? It's just basically a 15-year-old girl is talking about, going out with her friends or something. But you put it in a context where people don't expect youth to be similar to outside youth, or maybe outside youth that are kind of pushing the rebellious side, or being a little bit kind of quote unquote wild, then that's somehow newsworthy. In this picture here, completely in isolation, they're just 2 young people on bikes. What's particularly wild or racy about that? Well, Amish sell, right? That image is kind of appealing. Now, to that Cosmo article I talked about before, this is just a couple of years ago, 2020. This is how this story was pitched. You can find it on the internet. The Amish keep to themselves, and they're hiding a horrifying secret. Now, you read that and you think, oh no, these people are awful, right? This is basically it's like a cult or something like that. These stories of like, religious communities that are, doing horrible things behind closed doors and hiding, behind a sort of surface of like holier thou or something like that. And then the subtitle here, a year of reporting by Cosmo and type investigations reveals a culture of incest, rape, and abuse. a culture of rape and incest and abuse. Now, that's a pretty big statement here that basically says it's not just like horrible things that happen to have happened in people who happen to be members of plain communities. No, it's like it's somehow the fact that they are plain leads to this, is part of a culture of incest, rape, and abuse. Now, that's a really, really strong statement to make. That basically, an entire group of people, and specifically a religious community, is fundamentally dysfunctional and criminal, engaging in criminal behavior. These stories are true stories. We don't have hard and fast statistics on rates of, say, sexual abuse in plain communities versus non-plain communities. Those kind of data are not tracked. Anecdotally, coming from providers, human service providers who actually serve plain communities, the belief is that it's there, but that the rates are much lower than in the general population. But again, when you hear, it's like you don't expect it with these people that you would sort of hold to a higher standard. It's a little bit similar to the black eye that the Roman Catholic Church has gotten for various clergy abuse scandals or something. You do something like, say, Roman Catholic Church, just search that very quickly in Google, you'll be getting stories about abuse, right? And again, that's just simply a measure of the fact that this is what people are looking for in the internet, and this is what popular media are providing. They can be real stories. They're often true stories, but are they representative? That's the question. And this is something that's come up more recently. Tears of the Silenced, an Amish true crime memoir of child sexual abuse, brutal betrayal, and ultimate survival, right? By a woman who actually did grow up in a plain community, an Amish community, and suffered some really horrible things. Was it due to the fact that did she suffer because she happened to be born into an Amish community? No, she suffered because she was born into a very, very dysfunctional, messed up family who happened to be Amish. Their Amishness had nothing to do with the circumstances of their dysfunction and her abuse. But a lot of people sort of make the connection. It's like if you were to say all of a sudden to connect a person's religious affiliation immediately with abuse or some kind of crime, then you'd be presenting a distorted picture. It's like saying Wisconsin person reporting in another state guilty of sexual abuse, and you think, what are they doing in Wisconsin? What's going on in Wisconsin? Crazy stuff or something like that. Or we got my dinner at Culver's. It's like Culver's employee caught, watching pornography online. It's like, what are they doing at Culver's? It's like their employees are watching porn. It's horrible or something like that. It's like, employee, person who happens to work at Culver's, or person who happens to live in Wisconsin, or person who happens to be Amish, guilty of some crime. That would be represented. But again, the Amish are sort of fair game. Now, to really sort of understand who plain people are, one have to understand that they do pose a kind of riddle or paradox to outsiders. And this is an image that is not from reality TV. It's not staged, or it's not actors or anything like that. It's two young Amish women from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And this image was selected by the author of a really, really good book about the Amish. It's called The Riddle of Amish Culture. And what he does is really kind of explain sort of how the Amish, and by extension other plain people, just are really a paradox. People sort of like have a lot of questions about who they are, don't really get who plain people are. The reason the author selected this image is that because this image is for many people sort of paradoxical. They say, oh yeah, okay, from the knees up, it looks like, plain women, but they're on rollerblades. They're not supposed to do that. Why? Well, they're plain people. They're not supposed to be like the rest of us. Very, very important fact about plain people is that part of the secret to their survival and success in this country demographically is that they adapt with the times. They change with the times. And one of the things that's sort of like a relatively new development that's, I think, important for human services providers to know is an increasing recognition of things like abuse stories that are now making their way into the media, and that are, that represent situations that are not new, but have not been necessarily dealt with in effective ways in the past. That they are recognizing that one of the ways that they do need to change is to understand a little bit better about what sexual abuse is, or various kinds of family dysfunction, and ways that they can collaborate with professionals outside of their community. But it's sort of, it's a process. Ultimately, to understand plain people, you have to recognize that they are fundamental, that their faith is at the core of everything that they do. And so anything that is certainly a crime is considered not only, in the eyes of the law, a problem, but also morally reprehensible. So there's no Amish or Mennonite or plain person that would say that something like sexual abuse is excusable, or you can look the other way, or something that shouldn't be dealt with. They would say, not only do we recognize that it's a crime, it is something that is sinful behavior. And sinful behavior for a deeply, strongly religious community is a very, very major concern, right? And so the church plays an important role in kind of the moral side of addressing problems that come up within the community. Sometimes that can be a help, sometimes it can be a hindrance, though, in other circumstances. Very, very briefly, just to give you a sense of sort of the core beliefs of plain Anabaptists, and this will carry over to some things that human services providers would do well to understand. I mentioned the believers at baptism aspect before, so basically the idea that you should join the church as a sort of conscious decision. I also mentioned non-resistance, which is basically not fighting back. This has a very, very kind of strong correlate in terms of understanding justice and what justice means. So our sort of judicial system generally, when you think about crimes and punishment, we tend to be less about restorative justice and more about retributive justice. So it's like you do a crime and then you have to pay a penalty. You have to have a punishment. And the question of like forgiving, and I'll be explaining what forgiveness means, but the whole question of forgiving is something that is really almost alien in a lot of judicial situations. I'm thinking most recently about sort of the plain reaction to a very, very horrible case, which was the sentencing of the Parkland shooter, who was a teenager. We went down to that high school in Florida and killed I don't know how many kids in that high school. And basically he pled guilty. And then it came to the penalty phase, and the decision was he going to have life in prison without parole or the death penalty? And the jury decided it had to be a unanimous decision in favor of the death penalty. And so there were at least a couple of people that disagreed with that. And so he received life in prison without parole. And he's 19, 20 years old or something like that. And he's extremely young. And the reaction of a lot of people, including the survivors or of the tragedy, or the parents or the family members of kids that were killed in that, were extremely upset. And they were saying he should get death, right? He should have the death penalty. This is what the death penalty is there for. And there were a lot of people that agreed with that, right? And from a plain perspective, they were saying, is taking his life going to bring your child back or to make you truly feel better? In their view, that's vengeance. That's taking revenge. That's sort of the eye for an eye kind of approach. And for them, they find that to be morally unsound. They see that basically they personally themselves would not feel any sense of relief or release or satisfaction to see somebody's life being taken away, right, with that. And they also point out, as they say, guess what? I don't think any of us would want to spend the rest of our lives, maybe 60, 70 years in that guy's case, whatever, in prison with absolutely no chance of getting out. It's not like he's being sent to a spa, right? So non-resistance is something that is, we'll talk a little bit more about judicial matters in a moment, but it's an important religious doctrine here that carries over to wanting to be more interested in restorative justice rather than retributive justice. Separation of church and state is a sort of core aspect of all Anabaptists' faith. It's not controversial in the United States, right? Because it's enshrined in the US Constitution. Part of the belief that church and state should be separate is also a desire for plain people to basically not have their spiritual lives dictated or somehow regulated by outside authorities. And on the flip side, they say, we don't want to tell the government what to do. That's why they typically don't vote. They don't get involved in political activities really at all. But this can pose this sort of belief that church and state should be separated, sometimes makes things a little bit complicated, because if they're dealing with a matter that, say, like, for example, an abuse situation or some sort of situation that may, in the eyes of outsiders, be a crime or at least a source of concern, that if it has sort of like a church disciplinary side to it, they may want to keep the state, meaning like outside authorities or outside human services providers, somewhat at length, right? And they said, we want to deal with things in a sort of our way, in our kind of non-retributive, restorative justice way. We don't want to turn it over to, say, like social services, who made them as mandated reporters report things to the district attorney, and then things kind of escalate in ways that they feel would be inappropriate. By and large, their everyday lives are particularly remarkable as far as, like there's nothing of a culture of incest, rape, and abuse. In fact, they aim to very clearly live out their faith basically 24/7. They refer to this as being disciples. And essentially their role model in very explicit ways, they say Jesus. What would Jesus do? How would Jesus interact with people? Jesus was not a retributive, vengeful person. He was a forgiving person. He was somebody who did not fight back, for example. And they see the sort of virtue, cardinal virtue is humility, as something that they really strive towards. Now, something that also kind of fits into the sort of separation of church and state is that they feel that as sort of strongly convicted Christians, that they're probably going to be somewhat at odds from most of their neighbors, even neighbors that sort of profess a faith, including Christianity. And so they feel that it's important to kind of maintain a certain amount of distance between themselves, not necessarily off the grid, but a little bit more self-reliant, and realize that to live a life that has very sort of high moral standards, which they do hold themselves to, it's a little bit easier if you don't necessarily have a lot of everyday interactions with people who don't share those convictions. That was the original motivation for plain people making the decision not to send their kids to public schools after about the middle of the 20th century. So from their earliest times in America until really well into the 20th century, actually, plain kids attended regular public schools. When those public schools were rural country schools, right, community schools. When schools started to get consolidated, kids were sent to towns and buses, the curriculum started to head in directions that they felt uncomfortable with, certain kinds of outside values that they felt were not in line with their spiritual values, even though their schools do not teach faith at all, they're not religious schools at all. They said, especially like with teenagers, we don't feel comfortable with sending our youth, our teenagers to your typical public high school. They just felt that the situation there, it's a very tender age, and they just felt that this was something that was just not appropriate for them. So they made the decision to basically take control of their kids' education themselves by creating private schools that end at the 8th grade. And then after that, it's vocational education. That's also part of this kind of nonconformity and maintaining a certain amount of distance from the world. When the world was was more like them, then they were closer to it. And as a result, the attrition rate among plain people until the middle of the 20th century was actually relatively high. So it's 50-50 chance that about half of kids that were born to Amish, Mennonite, and Brethren parents actually left the old order, the more conservative churches, and went to more progressive churches. Today, that number has dropped down to only about 10% leaving, right? And the basic reason is that there is such a major difference now between being plain and non-plain, right? Certainly technology is one thing, but also a lot of things in terms of values that they just find really are just not in line with their spirituality. And certainly their kind of, limiting technology kind of fits into that, as well as their use of language. So let's talk specifically about children and youth, because really, the major areas of concern on the radar for human service providers are often things that apply to children and youth, to minors. First off is that no life is cheap, right? So even though they have lots of kids, every child is loved. Regardless of, how that child looks, whether that child is fully able, has any disabilities, any kind of, compromised in any way, every child is viewed as a gift from God. Family planning, birth control is fairly rare. The church has absolutely no formal stand on that, but most families make the decision not to limit family size. It's the sort of traditional value, children are a blessing. Now, one thing that's sort of distinctive, there are plenty of societies that simply where women don't have access to say, birth control and have lots and lots of babies, but many babies and many of their moms in many cases often don't necessarily survive. And so in other cultures, right, simply for lack of access to healthcare. So it's very interesting because they're having a lot of babies and most of those babies are doing just fine. They're surviving and their moms are surviving childbirth as well. And a lot of it has to do with, to a certain extent, their lifestyle on the healthcare side, but also their proximity to advanced healthcare networks, right? So basically, United States and Canada, very, very advanced in terms of being able to check maternal and infant morbidity. There's also a lot of contact across generations. So plain people typically get married, typically have kids if they're able to, and they start having kids pretty much right away. So they're getting married around 20, early 20s, having kids pretty much right away. Not unusual within the first year to have your first kid, and then basically stop once, about 20 years rolls around, which means that your typical plain family, if they're a couple, are grandparents in their 40s and great grandparents in their 60s. Just do the math, right? And I have some really good friends that live down in Kentucky. I was just down in the clinic down there doing a presentation, and I was able to spend a couple of days with them afterward. And they're in their early to mid 70s, like 74, 75, somewhere around there. And so I said, "How's it going, Emma?" And she said, "Great." She got back from Pennsylvania. Number 100 came along, the 100th grandchild. Yeah. And I said, "And there's probably still more coming." She said, "Yeah, oh yeah, they're coming." But her oldest grandchild, she's a great grandmother, the great grandparents as well. So her oldest grands are in their 30s, I think. So yeah, in their 30s. If you go in the Guinness Book of World Records and you look at sort of the record for the largest number of living descendants, it's this elderly Amish guy from Indiana who died in his 90s, and he has 790 something living descendants. That's like 14 kids who have like 14 kids at 14, it's like all the way down to great grands. That's a lot. That's a lot of birthday cards to fill out. And a lot of names that just end up being the same. It's like 15 Amos's, right? But part of plain society, and this is also marked outwardly in their dress, is that little Amish kids look like big Amish people, right? And that's not an accident, because they really say there should not be a generation gap, right? There really should be, that kids should be learning from elders, and it could be relatives, it could be just elder community members. And there are no words in their language in Pennsylvania Dutch for Mr. and Mrs. There are no titles. Everybody's on a first name basis, right? It's very, very informal in a lot of ways. Now, as I mentioned before, most kids, plain kids now attend parochial schools. When we think of parochial schools, we think of like religious education. They're church-run or they're community-run schools, but there is no religious education. It's completely secular content, and it's all taught in English. They end formally at the 8th grade. It's not forbidden to go on, but most make the decision not to go on. But if they would want to get a high school diploma, they would do it through a GED route rather than actually attending a high school. Some have actually attended college. It's typically women who are interested in going to healthcare, right? There's always been kind of a draw toward education and healthcare among plain women, especially those who really maybe are making a decision not to get married, or for whatever reasons are not married and want to have a kind of independent career. They would like to be home, work with in healthcare. Many plain women are also home health aides down in Florida, of all places. The only now urban Amish community is Sarasota. It started as snowbirds. Amish like to get out of the north in winter as well. Started about 100 years ago, and then they have like this sort of like bungalow community. It's known as Pinecraft, and then with urban sprawl, the rest of Sarasota just kind of incorporated it. So they don't have automobiles there, but they don't have horse and buggy because it's completely impractical in Florida to have horse and buggy. It's now a year-round community, and a lot of women, including those who would be, themselves, moms, but all their kids are up and gone and stuff like that. They're looking for a little bit of income. They know how to take care of people, and so they're home health aides, right? And there's obviously a very large need with the retired population everywhere in Florida. The first language for kids is Pennsylvania Dutch, which is a language that's related to German, but it's not mutually intelligible with German. But they do learn English very early. So like when they start school, which is in first grade. So they're completely bilingual. Kids learn very early on that sort of submissiveness is a virtue. Now we think of that in sort of negative terms. It kind of goes against the sort of major grain, but it's like basically, kids respecting their parents' authority. Parents respecting the authority of older folks, right? It's not like a very strict thing, because a lot of their church structures are very sort of democratic, sort of grassroots. So it's not like bishops make calls and say that when people do things or whatever, but there's definitely a sort of feeling that you should be respecting people that are in positions of authority. It's been referred to as soft patriarchy because the members of the ministry and people that say are members of school boards for the parochial schools, they're all male, right? So there are no women in leadership positions. So it would be patriarchal on the outside, but if you kind of pull the curtain back and you get to know families in more, intimate circumstances, women have a lot of say in things. And this is very important too. Like, for example, let's say that there's been involved in situations like a domestic abuse situation where a husband was physically abusing his wife. And the bishop in the community or in the neighboring church district felt like this was really difficult for him to kind of manage because there's no formal training in this. And so he asked his wife to help him out, right? And so wives, bishops' wives or ministers' wives often become very good assets, especially when it comes to relating with women who are victims of, say, abuse of some kind. So that sort of gender matching thing. So it's kind of, even though a bishop's wife has no formal authority whatsoever, these women can have a certain amount of clout in many ways. Also, when it comes to, like, say, in healthcare situations, providers often say that it's like, well, mom and dad don't necessarily talk very much, and dad is kind of the spokesperson. I'm kind of curious what mom says, but it's very different when grandma comes. Grandma's like talking up, asking all these questions. Grandmas, I don't know, really, plain grandmas have a real reputation for just saying whatever they feel like saying. All right, and they've kind of seen it all and being a little bit more blunt. Corporal punishment is still practiced, but it's very limited, but it is practiced. So it's something, like I experienced spanking when I was a kid. I look back and I think it was not necessary. I was a decent kid too, but I think even if I had been maybe less well behaved, I still don't think it's a good idea. And that's not a choice that my wife and I made for our daughter. And it's not something that I would particularly recommend, but they still practice limited corporal punishment. Now, the major misunderstanding about children and youth among plain people is rumspringen. This is like the one Pennsylvania Dutch word that's kind of made its way into American popular discourse. It literally means running around. And so let's go back, imagine that situation of like, Amish teens on the wild side and, on your cell phone and going to parties and all these things. There's this, and even the Wikipedia page gets it wrong. If you look up rumspringen on the Wikipedia, they got it wrong. It basically just defines this as a period when parents allow, or in some cases encourage, their kids to sort of discover the world, sow their wild oats, experience things, and then hopefully come back to the community and settle down. That is not correct. Rumspringen, despite the literal thing, it sounds racy, like running around. All it means is when you turn 16, you are permitted with your other 16 and older youth, unmarried youth, to get together without adult supervision. That's all it means. And you're allowed to date, right? Your boyfriend or girl. That's all it means. And in the same way, let's all reflect back on our high school experiences, right? And there was always that segment of a class, probably not the dominant group, but there was always some group that was like smoking cigarettes behind the gym, or drinking, or whatever, doing things that maybe not everybody should do, kind of pushing the envelope a little bit more. There was that element. Yes, there's that element. Amish are human beings too, and Amish youth are youth as well. There is that segment. And the stories of the Amish kid that gets the 6-pack of beer and gets drunk and then is pulled over by a sheriff because his buggy is weaving. Those are true stories, but they're not representative stories, in the same way that the kids smoking cigarettes behind the gym in our high school classes or whatever during the middle of the day are not necessarily representative. I teach at UW-Madison, and UW-Madison has a reputation for kind of party culture and that sort of thing. There's a street that has a lot of fraternities called Langdon Street, right? And it's just away from campus. And I said, if I were to do a documentary on UW-Madison students, right? And I were to take my camera and walk down Langdon Street on a warm Friday evening or Saturday evening about 11 o'clock and just record, I would see a lot of things that's all not staged, it's all true, or whatever. But if I were to say, here's a documentary about Badger youth, and they say, well, yeah, it's true, but that was like Friday night, it was on Langdon Avenue, and you didn't show the kids that were like studying in the library, or those that were not like drinking and tossing cushions out of the window or something like that. So it's just but it's there. And as I say, they're human beings, and there is a small percentage that definitely displays rebellious behavior, makes it into paper. Now, when it comes to child abuse and neglect, as I said before, it is not excusable. It's completely regarded as unacceptable, and it's sinful behavior. So it's not just illegal, it's not just bad, it's just not nice. It is sinful. Anecdotally, again, we don't have statistics on this, but it's considered by providers to be, and those who serve plain communities, to be fairly rare, but it is definitely not non-existent. Part of, let's say, specifically child sexual abuse is that there are relatively few opportunities for kids to be lured away from larger groups because they're constantly around a lot of other people. So there are always a lot of eyes on kids. When abuse happens, it's typically not physical abuse, but sexual abuse. That sexual abuse typically is incest. That means abuse happening within families, so that there's, like, say, it's actually physically happening within a home, right? So a brother on a sister, a male cousin on a female cousin, or in some cases dad on daughter or something like that. But basically, where you have, in your sort of immediate home, that's when you have actual more privacy, and then the opportunities to commit crimes are greater. But again, it's extremely rare, right? But nonetheless, it does happen. Now, there's definitely a case of underreporting, but what's new? Abuse is underreported generally across the board. I mean, going back to UW-Madison, we did, surveys about students, focusing especially on female students who've experienced some form of sexual abuse in their 4 years or whatever at Madison. And it's strikingly high. It's like 1 out of 4, right? 25%. The vast majority of those situations, including cases of rape, are not reported, right? And what we're trying to do is to basically sort of increase that so that we can move toward a greater culture of prevention. But it's underreporting is definitely not limited to plain people, but it's among plain people as well when it occurs. Now, there's some situations where child abuse and neglect may be misidentified, right? So when child protective service workers or social workers, human service workers come and visit a family, with a concern of some kind, and they see older kids supervising younger kids, and say, where are the adults, right? It is definitely true that plain kids are often charged with greater responsibilities than their non-plain counterparts. But many of those kids are able to discharge those responsibilities quite well, right? Plain kids learn at a fairly young age, at least younger than in the general population, how to assume responsibilities. I have an older Mennonite family, a couple friends, I mean, they have lots of kids, it's 13 kids. I've known for many, many years. And I remember asking Anna, the wife, once, I said, so, at that point, I think they had like 9 or 10 kids or something like that. Now it's up to 13 and like a bunch of grandkids and great grands. And so I asked her, I said, when was like the hardest time for you? And she said, when number 6 was born, she says, because number 1 couldn't make dinner yet. But then when number 7 came along, she said, number 1, who was like 12, was able to make dinner, And so it's just, they do learn responsibilities. Don't be alarmed if you see older kids supervising younger kids, because in many cases, those older kids do know what they're doing. Farms are dangerous places. And so farms, the accidents, we talked about this in the last session as well. Farm safety is an important concern. And this is one area where plain communities feel more receptive to getting outside information and having farm safety days and presentations at schools and stuff to talk about sort of basics of maintaining farm safety. There are definitely children, and plain children are at a greater risk of injury due to burns, simply because, living in a plain home, you're in closer proximity to hot surfaces. And often things like, for example, I've heard of scalding situations where little toddlers have actually sat down in like a 5-gallon bucket of basically scalding water because it's very, very hot water that's been brought out into the dairy barn for chores or something like that. Also, the design layout of most Amish homes is what we call open concept. So it's like kitchen, eating, dining area, living room, play area. It's all kind of one big space, which means that's the center of activity. Means that the kids are not in the basement or in a playroom or something like that. They're right there. And if something kind of runs over the stove and all of a sudden reaches up on the pot that's on the stove, and then that kind of thing, there can be problems. Also, one thing that in terms of mistakenly identifying abuse, this is something one of my areas of healthcare advocacy is to do with burn and wound care with an Amish developed method called EW. And one thing that I did not know before I was involved in advocacy for this is that the most common form of physical abuse of children in American society is burns. And the most common form of burn is scalding. And so, like, for example, really, terrible things done by adults to kids is to run a really, really hot bath, right? And then just set the kid in there, and then they're being scalded from here down. And so in situations where, like, say, a plain kid, a girl or boy or whatever is like toddler is just like fallen down into a bucket of some hot material. And there have been cases, I know of one where a mom was making ketchup and was boiling tomatoes, went to the neighbors, told her husband to put it down on this area sort of behind a door. There was a commotion outside and they had a toddler who ran in the house and was going to hide behind the door. Didn't know that this pot of, basically semi-boiled tomatoes was there and then fell into it. Dad was right there, pulled it out, but she had second-degree burns like that. And so understandably, she comes to the emergency department and they're saying, well, what happened? What's the story? Let's get the story to match. So, sometimes plain people, because they're in critical situations or emergent situations at least, and are very upset, they don't necessarily feel comfortable expressing themselves. And English is, to a certain extent, their second language, and then things can sort of escalate and they say, what are they hiding? Right? These religious, whatever types. In general, they prefer, this is what we talked about in healthcare, segment, that community internal resources for healthcare are preferred over outside ones, which means that, they're not going to rush to the doctor, or they don't rush to the doctor in circumstances when many outside people will. That can sort of seem to outsiders, right, as like, is this potentially neglect here? Or are they trying to hide abuse because they're not taking their kid to the doctor? From their point of view, they'd say, a lot of things don't rise to the level of taking my child to the doctor. I can take care of them at home. And then these sort of high profile media stories of abuse and neglect, the sort of classic ex-Amish stories, overwhelmingly stories of women who have left, who experience sexual abuse. That's the most common thing. And those stories are true. There are true stories. I don't know, the most notorious stories I've heard, not any of that is false at all. It's just how they're spun in the media. And then, sort of in line with their kind of value of humility as part of their discipleship is that they're not particularly outwardly expressive. They don't really show a lot of extremes of emotion. And when you're kind of stony-faced in a lot of sort of circumstances, then people are wondering, it's like, do they love their kids? They don't seem very affectionate or something. And I've heard, for example, nurses say that too, right? And here's one thing that, I don't often share or whatever, but this was a mom and an Amish mom with a child who was in the hospital with an injury. And, mom was a loving mom, an excellent mom. The injury, I can't remember what it was, but it definitely wasn't due to abuse or neglect. And the child started to shriek. And the mom said, you can cry, but you can't scream. And if she's there in Pennsylvania Dutch, and if the nurse or whoever had heard that, they would say, isn't that cruel? Isn't that mean? From the mom's perspective, she was thinking, as most Amish people do, it's like, to overreact is not going to make you feel better. It's not going to reduce the pain by screaming. You're experiencing pain, I understand that, but to scream is not going to help. It's not like she wants to, keep a good impression of the, not have it carried down the hall. She was saying, it's not going to do anything good to scream. Right? But again, you sort of say that, and you're outsiders and think, oh, whatever. It just sort of comes off in a sort of negative way, but it's not. I don't really think it is negative. So we talked a little bit already about healthcare. I'll just kind of move through this fairly quickly because we have talked about it, but there's a preference for within the community at-home care, hands-on care, natural remedies. They don't carry health insurance or accept government assistance, which means that they're paying out of pocket, which is a real challenge, obviously, because of the way that the business side of healthcare works. And so they're looking to limit the expenses that they will have, but not at the expense of their children's health. There's a strong emphasis on community support. So this is where one of the many ways that the pandemic really was problematic for plain people is because you have one plain patient in a hospital. At any given time, you're going to see like maybe 6 plain people on the floor, like typically in the room, in the waiting area, downstairs or something like that. And when you're in, as like many hospitals were, and some to I think a certain extent are, when you're really limiting the visitors on the floors and they don't have smartphones and tablets to be able to communicate with their loved ones outside, it's hard. There was one really beautiful situation of a gentleman who's an older man who has prostate cancer and had surgery and had to be in the hospital for that. And he really wanted to see his kids and his grandkids. And so, they said, sorry, we can't, let them really enter into the waiting. They can't come down or whatever. But this nurse was saying, I think the weather's going to be halfway decent today. He needs to get some pressure anyway, so you should buy him out of the parking lot. And then the family formed a circle around him and then sang songs to him. The nurse cried, no crying, tell me about it. And the grandpa cried, but he felt so much better. And I thought, good for you, nurse. What a great call that you made there to kind of adapt to the circumstances. And no rules were violated. But these were things that's like this nurse recognized that this is a very, it's a difficult challenge for people who are just constantly having each other's back. I think it's all about helping people. So one doc I talked to, he says, Mark, he says, if I were to break my leg, I don't know that my neighbor would be like coming over to mow my lawn for me. He says, Mark, I don't even know if my kids, I could rely on them to mow my lawn. I said, oh, come on, Lee, I bet you could. And he said, well, but it's like a plain people. It's like, you don't even ask. It's like, oh, yeah, we're in the hospital. Okay, George, we'll take care of it. Oh, grocery shop, laundry. Yeah, well, I'll just go and get it for you and I'll do it. Kind of thing. It's just like really, really a very different kind of approach. And so there's a strong value of community assistance. When it comes to accessing mental health sources, this is still a sort of a major challenge. It's very difficult for plain people to separate spiritual health from mental health. They're also very, as a community-oriented group, very uncomfortable with individual therapy. They just prefer group therapy. And again, here, like with sort of physical health care, they prefer community internal resources and residential facilities, but there are way too few of those available. When it comes to dealing with law enforcement, we're back to non-resistance. They technically see themselves to like report crimes as a very uncomfortable situation because they don't want to be seeming to be offensive, right? So they report crimes where they feel that if the criminal behavior is not stopped, or if there's a chance that something is going to occur, like somebody who is, driving drunk and still on the road or something like that, they will call it in. Or if somebody is like, committing multiple crimes like robberies in a neighborhood or serial sexual abuse or something like that, then they would say, okay, this needs to stop and we do need to turn it over to law enforcement. But they don't hire lawyers, they don't file lawsuits, right? They will hire lawyers only if they need to hire a lawyer to defend themselves. But if it's a criminal case and they are guilty of whatever crime they're charged with, they will plead guilty. Right? They'll say they're guilty. And this is actually really frustrating for lawyers because they say, not every crime that you're charged with is something that you should be charged with. So typically the way it happens is the DA says, okay, we're going to, give you these charges, and then we'll maybe work it down to like 2 charges or something. Just because they've done something bad doesn't mean that they're guilty of all the specific charges that they've been indicted with. Again, they don't file lawsuits. Again, forgiveness is a virtue. What does forgiveness mean? It does not mean excusing, it does not mean condoning, it does not mean forgetting and like forgive and forget or sweeping under the rug. It means foregoing your right to revenge and vengeance. It means like say, it's not going to make the situation any better or me feel any more comfortable or at peace by getting revenge. And this is what's referred to in the judicial system as restorative justice, right? So rather than like looking at like how many sentences, how many years we can give to offenders, it's like, how can we bring things back? How can we repair things, right? That's the way that they look at it. It's a match with our judicial system and really with our mainstream culture. There's also, in the same way that there's a kind of preference to kind of address physical and behavioral health concerns within the community, certain kinds of issues, disputes, problems that would be maybe considered crimes, criminal actions in the eyes of the law, sometimes they prefer to deal with it within the church. There's definitely a challenge of working with the ministry. So bishop, ministers, and deacons, because they're all male, they have no formal training really in any area, including theology, let alone social work, therapy, that kind of thing. So it's basically they have to go on their instincts and then rely on their wives' instincts or rely on their friends' instincts. Many are not aware that as members, they're technically clergy in the eyes of the law, that they are mandated reporters. And this is something that also teachers need to be aware of too. So that's something that I, in particular, for example, will kind of explain what is a mandated reporter and what that means. And in general, they often view the legal system as being, specifically the legal system, not necessarily human services, as sort of having values that are at odds with the Christian faith, and especially the sort of like dismissal of forgiveness as being like wimpy. Now, specifically with social or human services, some practical things to consider. Yes, they are all being bilingual, but English is their second language, right? And so they're maybe not necessarily experienced in talking about sensitive matters in English, or maybe just not talking about them at all. But sometimes it's a little bit cumbersome to express themselves in English. If they're like transacting business or talking about things like that you occur in school, right? Because school is all in English, like, and that's completely in English. But when you're talking about things that are really sensitive matters, you may not necessarily, it's like those are conversations that you only have with other members of your community. You're not talking about, say, your marital problems with your neighbor who doesn't speak Pennsylvania Dutch. Well, then it's difficult to talk. It's hard to find the vocabulary. I've had this over and over again as a Pennsylvania Dutch speaker. It's like people say, "Oh, so much better just to speak Pennsylvania Dutch," right? This one woman just said, and told me once, she said, "Oh, I can just vent Pennsylvania Dutch." Because I don't like watch what I'm saying. She's like, I can just say whatever I want. In general, a lot of things they don't. I mean, this is true for a lot of people. It's just they tend to keep in sensitive matters, but not talk about a lot of sensitive matters. So things like things that pertain to sexuality, right? And like having a birds and bee conversation with your teenagers, or when young people are getting ready to marry. Some communities are doing better jobs than others in terms of like having we call like premarital counseling or something. There's also a fear that somehow that human services workers or specific child protective services workers are there to remove kids from home, right, and to tear families apart. There's a fear of that, which is probably not unique to plain people. Now, in general, they feel more comfortable in interacting with people that are the same gender, so female to female, especially if the females that they're interacting with are married and have kids. It's just easier for married women with kids to talk to other married women with kids. And just say, is this something you experience in so many aspects of life? Is this something that you experience too? Just that sort of first name basis and wanting to develop personal relations. They often they don't expect other people to have the same religious views as do, but they do find it kind of nice if the people that they're working with are people of faith, maybe Christians, who if not, and being Anabaptists, at least know something about their faith and respect it rather than sort of dismissing it. In visiting homes, it's considered appropriate to dress somewhat modestly. So women to have things that are not particularly low cut, maybe not a lot of perfume and jewelry. But they're very happy if you take off your shoes and go barefoot because they're, running on being fairly informal. But males or females that dress in shorts in their homes, that's something that's unusual. I mean, they see it all the time, but they just, it would be sort of a barrier in the same way that it would be a barrier if I walked in here and I wore a tuxedo, right? It would be completely inappropriate. I was like, why is Louden wearing a tuxedo? On the other hand, if I were wearing like a t-shirt and shorts and flip-flops, you would probably be thinking the same things like, what's he? It's like snowing, he's wearing flip-flops. So it's basically kind of dress in a way that doesn't really distract from the situation. And they appreciate people that listen more than they talk. So, by way of kind of wrapping things up, just to show some images, that Amish people and plain people generally tend to be very, very happy. And there have been studies that say, like, are you happy with your life? So, like with adult females and adult males, and typically, especially as they get older, say, I'm just really happy. I really feel comfortable in the life decision that I made. In terms of a resource, I haven't talked about this at all, but this is the tragic West Nickel Mines school shooting, one of the horrific school shootings that happened in the United States. It was at an Amish school, 10 girls shot, 5 killed and 5 wounded. That was 16 years ago in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. That message of forgiveness was something that really resonated because immediately they reached out. I was literally listening to the podcast that was driving up here. Somebody mentioned that story and said, "Oh, the Amish and forgiving the school shooter." And basically they forgave the shooter, and he'd taken his own life, but they forgave the shooter by reaching out to the family and saying, "We're not holding any grudges against you." And in the wake of that shooting, there was international news, and there were millions of dollars that were donated for the funeral expenses and the medical expenses for the survivors. And there was a steward committee of Amish to manage these funds. And they insisted that a certain percentage of the funds would be set aside for the shooter's family and his kids, right? not as a reward, obviously, but they say you've lost something too, and you are suffering, and you will deal with this for the rest of your lives in the same way that we are dealing with this for the rest of our lives. This is a really good book. There's actually also a one person play that was, I know, in Milwaukee. I think it also has the title Amish Grace. But I really recommend it. It's just something, it's not about the gory details of what happened, it's about the reaction, and it really I think gets people to think about what does it mean to forgive. I was chatting with Amish guy once at an IHOP in Madison. We were having brunch together, and I was talking about, the word to forgive in Pennsylvania Dutch, "forgeven," also means to give away, like just to get rid of, give away. And I remember he said, "Yeah, forgeven." It goes like getting rid of this stuff, like just sort of, these feelings of like hate and anger and stuff. He said, "Of course, it's a process. You can't just like sort of move on and everything's fine." He said, "I know one family that had lost a daughter in there, a wounded daughter, and a third daughter who escaped, and that family will never be the same." Right? They will never be the same. They don't talk about it as much, but it's something that has scarred their lives forever. But they're looking forward. And this was another case of two Amish girls in a very, very conservative community in New York who were, so they were in the dairy barn, and this community has produce stands by the side of the road. And so basically it can be like sort of self-serve. People come up and they see the prices and they put the money in a can. So the family was out, it was chore time in the evening or late afternoon, so it's still light, and they saw this car pull up, and the car just sort of stayed in front of this produce stand. And so the dad just said, "Well, go out and see if these people need help. Maybe they have some questions or something." And those two people kidnapped the girls and held them for 24 hours. It was right on the Canadian border. They shut down the Canadian borders, like all kinds of alerts, Amber Alert, these kinds of things going around. And they were dropped off in another town, released by this couple. In the 24 hours they had been sexually abused, and but they were released, and obviously the parents were overjoyed. And the couple, they sort of, in a town where there were no Amish, and the kids ran to the first door, and they knocked on the door, and the couple like immediately recognized who they were and brought them in. And then the family, once, like a couple of days later, the dad takes his horse and buggy and drives over there, and he said, "I just want to thank you in person." And then the couple said, "Well, we're glad we could help out." And then he kind of looked and he says, "Boy," he says, "your garage looks like it needs replacing." And so he replaced his garage. He just tore down the old one, built a new one. But he was asked by reporters, he said, "No, so what do you think about these?" It was a couple, right? Not married couple, but male and female couple. And he said, "Well, they've really screwed up their lives." He said, "They're probably going to be in prison for the rest of their lives." So he felt sorry for them. He didn't excuse what they did, right? And he felt horrible, and they know that their girls are going to probably struggle for the rest of their lives with this. And said, but he's like, feel sorry for them, right? Sandy Hook, was one of the most notorious school shootings, which happened after Nickel Mines. And very quietly, the Nickel Mines families, right, the survivors' family, the families of those who were victims, basically have kind of taken upon themselves to reach out to other communities who have experienced school shootings. And they say, "We know what you're going through because we went through it. Here are some strategies that we've gone through to heal." And Sandy Hook was, was all these first grade kids that were murdered in that situation. Thankfully, these kinds of, horrible incidents are rare. Community life is, there's no way you could be like a plain hermit. Right? It's just, there's so much activity, and it's partly because the family sizes are large, but people just like getting together. They like eating food together. They like playing house, and it's kind of cute. When I had blown up this picture, I realized that she has a pack of Smarties. How much kids love Smarties? It's like the official candy of the older children. Physical activity. Schools are important community building institutions. In terms of like building relationships with communities, visiting schools is kind of a nice thing to do in terms of like also in a professional capacity, like doing a little farm safety presentation at schools. Sometimes public schools will like sort of like bring their public school kids and say, "Well, let's see what class school was like in your grandparents or great grandparents' time. The school was at this Amish school." So these nice kind of relationships develop there. They're really, really fun school visits. Youth are very, very happy. Just overall, they just are very, very happy with their lives because they realize that, they have, contacts with non-Amish people, and there's a lot of unhappiness, a lot of loneliness, a lot of stress, a lot of, things that they just are great. They're just grateful for the support of their community and their families. And that especially increases as people get older, and they just feel it's like, I don't have to worry about money, pensions, anything like that. My needs will be taken care of. Even if they were never married or never had kids or something like that, don't have any direct descendants, their community will take care of them. I know a woman in a community not too far from here who had 21 stepkids. She married a widower who had been widowed once before. So it was like 17 kids in one family, 4 in the other, or 14 and 7, something like that. So very large number of kids. And so she outlived her husband and had all these kids, and then, stepkids and all these descendants. And she had a series of strokes, and she was basically bedfast. And so there was never a question that she was going to be like put into some sort of home or whatever. She stayed in her home, and 24/7 there was a couple, right? So it'd be like one of her stepkids and their spouse who would just be with her for like 6 hours or 7 hours or something, and then the next couple would come, the next couple would come, 24/7 until she passed. Schools are great. We're visiting schools. Kids are cute in schools. And it's just a really neat environment. And schools are very, very important to kind of building community values. These are a couple of books that I recommend. Overview of kind of who the Amish are. This is also the companion volume to a documentary that was made for public television. It's called The American Experience. That's the show. It's called The Amish. This was a program, a documentary film that was made in cooperation with the support of Amish. Because they say we are not going to tell you what the script should be, but we want to have some control over it, so it's a balanced view. It's also just beautiful as a kind of like makes you feel good. I think it's just a really neat documentary, and many libraries have it on DVD. This is a book that I actually used. I teach an Amish course in our religious studies program every other year. I really like. It's called The Amish Way: Patient Faith in a Perilous World. And what I like is that it really kind of explains Amish culture from the point of view of how their faith is at the core of what they do. So really kind of explaining, because for them it's like, nothing makes sense unless you understand where we're coming from spiritually, right? And this does a really, really good job of that. And then another book that's like specifically for human services providers is, I can't recommend enough, Serving the Amish, a cultural guide for professionals. Jim Cates is actually a therapist from Indiana who has worked with Amish clients for years. He does home visits, right? So he'll like go into a home and do a counseling session in somebody's kitchen or in somebody's bedroom, in somebody's shop or something like that. If he if the client wants somebody else there, sure, let him be there too, right? So he's developed a really, really good sense. He's not a plain or Anabaptist background himself, but he's really developed a good sense of cultural sensitivity. And what I really like is that it really kind of gives like a crash course in who plain people are, and specifically Amish. And then the various professionals are not just like therapists like him, but includes therapists, but be like social workers and child protective service workers and healthcare providers and law enforcement and people in the legal system like district attorneys. And Jim has written a second book that's somewhat more recent that explains sexuality and development. It's called Serpent in the Garden: Amish Sexuality in a Changing World. Because that's really important to understand, because of many of the crimes that make their way onto the radar of human services providers are often of a sexual nature. And so kind of understanding plain sexuality is very, very important. So Jim Cates. And then the last book that I'm going to share with you is actually produced by an old order Mennonite man in conjunction with a professor of social services, human service specialist at a university, which is now at Goshen College in Indiana. She's actually a Mennonite herself. For the Sake of a Child: Love, Safety, and Abuse in Our Plain Communities. And it's a publication that is targeted. It's a fairly thin volume, but it's great for anybody to read. But it's basically for all plain communities, for people to kind of be aware of what abuse is and stuff about the laws and the long-term consequences of things, the challenges of forgiveness, all that kind of thing. And basically they've made it such that it's very produced at cost, and the publisher is basically just saying, we don't want to make a profit on it. We would ideally like to see this book in every plain in the country. And so some wealthier plain people or some wealthy plain people that have very successful businesses and stuff will basically send a check for $50,000 or something to the publisher, so the book can be distributed. And then this is an article that's from Psychology Today. It's just a few years ago, and it's the same author here, this professor of social work, Jeanette Harder. She's the co-author of this, but this is from Psychology Today. It's actually a really good sort of like do's and don'ts and like kind of a quick and dirty about sort of working with Amish families when you've got specifically child abuse and neglect. So it's special abuse and neglect risks we can help. And it's a lot better kind of approach than saying culture of incest, rape, and abuse, that kind of thing. I really like this article. It's really a good thing. For general questions about plain people and specifically Amish, just Google Amish studies, and that will take you to the website of the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies, which is part of Elizabethtown College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And that's the really good clearinghouse for like information on things like FAQs, right? Like sort of, Rumspringa or something. Religion, social organization, cultural practices, basic statistics, like they update their population statistics over years. Resources, like for other things like the other books that I've talked about, readings, the DVD that I mentioned, and then a list of experts. We have specific areas of special education. The last slide I'm going to leave you with is just to kind of tie things up about sort of how plain people really kind of view themselves and their faith. You see this like little signs that say joy. What is joy? And they say Jesus before others, before yourself. And it was about a year ago, just reading the New York Times. This is an article that has nothing to do with plain people, has nothing to do with religion at all. It basically is an article by a study that was done by sociologists that were saying we're in such a tense moment in American society, especially politically. There are all these divisions, political, social, tension and anger and hatred. Even it's like, what makes people happy? And they were looking at specifically at people that profess to be liberals versus professing conservatives in politics. And what they found was, regardless, it's not like liberals are happier than conservatives or vice versa. It's nothing to do with where you are on the political spectrum. It's about how you view what you do as a social being, how you contribute to society. And this is a very simple sentence that I think sums it up nicely. Individual personal happiness is more likely to be found not by directly pursuing it, like I'm going to treat myself, not that, but by embracing social institutions that call on us to focus first on the welfare of others. So basically, it's like we feel better as individuals if we make other people feel better. We can make our, it's like I just got Culver's and I do feel good about that, right? I treated myself or whatever. But I would probably feel better if, like, my daughter with me and she really wanted those cheese curds, right? And so I say, Clara, let's have dinner together, and I'll get you lunch, you want whatever. That would make me feel even better, that I'd still feel good about me. And I think if we reflect on that, it's like the feeling of like we've made somebody happy. We've had somebody feel grateful. I mean, it's like, I thrive on that kind of thing. I like pats on the back, kind of thing. And I think that I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And that's something that I think without the Amish or plain people intending that, I think that really is sort of expresses kind of like why they are such happy people. All right. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have, including questions that we might have online.
We have no questions.
Okay.
That came in.
I get my root beer.
I have one. You're talking about, potential sexual abuse in the Amish or in the plain community. And knowing their forgiveness, etc. And I don't know if there would be statistics then. What about outside people sexually assaulting, the 16-year-olds or other age groups even? And, would they report that or would they forgive that person or?
They would still do the forgiveness piece. It doesn't make any difference who the offender is. Because again, they say, they would, if they're going to report something, they're going to report it regardless of who the offender is. Mm-hmm. There was, maybe 2 years ago or something, a young Amish, it's like, well, she's maybe 16, 17, 18 years old or something, an Amish girl walking back from church on a nice Sunday afternoon. was abducted and murdered. And by an outsider, right? The guy just drove up and then murdered her. I think he's already been convicted, I'm not sure. And, you know, there was like these search parties and they found pieces of her clothing in the woods and that sort of thing. And again, from the Amish perspective, it's like, you know, it's a horrible tragedy. It's just, people were just, you know, grieving over that. But it didn't make any difference who the offender was. It's like they didn't feel any more, you know, like that he needed to be punished more or something like that. They basically felt this guy should pay whatever price the judicial system says. But we personally forgive him. We're just not going to obsess. We're not going to like attend the trial or anything like that because it's not going to make us feel any better.
Now you said she was killed, so I guess if somebody was sexually assaulted, you think it would be treated differently?
No. There was a case some years ago now of another girl that was walking back from school here in Wisconsin, was raped, abducted and raped. And then the community, I think they were able to get the offender, the perpetrator fairly quickly, but then the community said, well, we're not going to allow the kids to walk alone. Or they're going to have them in larger groups or something like that. So they basically say, we thought it was, you know, walking down this county road would be perfectly safe, but apparently it isn't. So then they sort of say, well, we need to address that.
So to kind of follow up on that, how, I guess, is it, I mean, maybe it's kind of different between every community, but I guess what determines, I know you had mentioned they like to solve things or kind of deal with things internally. I guess, like, is there kind of a certain threshold or certain like crimes or things where they decide to like kind of seek that?
No, because it really is community specific. There are some communities that are just better or have already developed relationships with outsiders, with outside providers that are more trusting, that may be willing to cooperate earlier than
Maybe
others.
more that comfort level.
It's the
or
comfort level,
relationship
it's the personalities that are involved. It really is, there's nothing that's sort of across the board with that. But it is a challenge, and it's you know, one thing that you know, they're more, I'd say, trusting of offenders who profess, you know, acknowledge what they did, don't lie about it, and really promise to do better. And don't necessarily understand that it's like, say, alcoholism. It's like you just can't sort of say, okay, I won't drink anymore. Right? That certain, you know, sexual offenders just, they need to be separated from kids, or they need to have some kind of intervention or something like that, rather than just saying, go and sin no more kind of thing. But you know, like this guy, Alan Hoover, that was the co-author of that one book, and he and I were talking about it, and he said, yeah, I said, like, you know, if somebody has a drinking problem, I'm going to make sure that that person doesn't get anywhere close to a tavern all alone. And I'm going to make sure that there's no alcohol, that they're not in a home where there's alcohol that's easily accessible. He said, sort of like trust and verify. It's not a question of not forgiving. It's just a question of like, some people just need more help and they need more guardrails. And that means in a kind of probation sort of situation. But some communities understand that better than others. Right? And there's a situation I was involved in actually somewhat recently where there was I don't know the individuals involved, but I received a call where there was a father that had admitted to molesting his daughter and was given, this was in the state of Indiana, it's like different stages, and it's like stage 1 is the worst, and stage 4, something like that. But it was like the lawyer could have gotten him a sort of a better stage. So he's still on the sex offender registry. He was given a sentence of 3 years in state prison, and then was basically is not allowed to live with his kids, with his wife and kids, until they're 18 or have any direct contact with them 18. So he can't be with them really at all until they turn 18. And the daughter that he molested is now like 12 or 13 or something. And the community is like saying she really wants her dad back home. And, you know, mom is really upset. The rest of the kids are upset because dad is out, but he's living, you know, like a couple of miles away. And he said, and the guy told me, he said, he's paid his penalty, right? And I said, well, his penalty was actually also these other terms. It wasn't just the 3 years. I said, it was beyond that. I said, I don't know whether, I said, I don't know. I said, you don't know. I said, like, to what extent this guy still poses a risk. Right? And I said, the bottom line is social workers and the judicial system don't want to keep punishing for the sake of punishing. I said, they just want to make sure that that girl and other kids are protected. So those are tough situations, but when you've got the communities where I saying, but it seems like he's doing fine and he already paid his price and that kind of thing. It's like, maybe not.
Just some comments and thank you, some wonderful presentations. I completely 100% agree. Nobody else has anything? We'll thank Mark for his time, and if you'd like to stick around, they said for the 5:30 general session, we will be here.
Right. Thanks again.